Hi everyone, welcome to this month's webinar. So this month we are talking about breakdown logons. You have myself and you have Matt. How you doing, Matt?
I'm doing very well. Yourself, James?
Excellent. No, really good. I've been really looking forward to this, and seems like we have a really good attendance today. So let's not wait around and let's get moving. All right. So first of all, probably a lot of people have been interested in this, so we have a Bose speaker to give away. But we're not giving it away till the end of the presentation. So you need to stick around if you want to be in the draw for the speaker. So that's that. So just before we get into the topic, which we're obviously going to look at logons, wanted to give you a quick overview of Liquidware. So we do digital workspace solutions. We have a whole suite of solutions around four kind of key areas that we feel that help you in your environments. So first, we have application portability. We've got Flex App, provides seamless app delivery with dynamically adapted applications. So you can just determine when those applications are delivered to your desktops and your users. Then we've got Profile Unity. It's all about users and application management, profile portability, and you have context aware preferences, etc. Then we've got our DEX monitoring. This is Stratusphere UX. This is what we're going to go deep on today. And we're going to go even deeper because we're going to go into login breakdown, which is a specific component of Stratusphere. But overall, Stratusphere is all about collecting all of that data and analytics and then, being able to support the complete cycle of your workspace. If you're doing a migration, you can do side by side comparison and it gives you all of that kind of deep, detailed information. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Finally, we have our newest solution. This is real-time DEX remediation. This is our SaaS solution, Command Control. It's all about allowing your monitoring or remediation of remote endpoints from anywhere. And it's a very simplified thing that we have a whole suite of tools that allows you to kind of remediate endpoints from our console. So that's an overview of what we as Liquidware do. So let's move on. So we're focused a little bit on DEX today. So here you have, I'm not going to even read it out because it's too long. This is what DEX is according to Gartner. So digital employee experience for everyone who, or for anyone who hasn't do it. It's all about how your user experience is. Hence why we're focusing on logon breakdown today, because logons are so critical to user experience. So we have here the detailed Gartner explanation of what is DEX. And we instead like to say that it's like a sound engineer in a live concert. You get all of that kind of data and you can analyze if there's anything going wrong and look at it and point out and change. And that's what we see DEX as. Okay, so Liquidware. We've been asked this before. Liquidware is completely platform agnostic. It doesn't matter if you're on Citrix, if you're on Horizon, if you're on physical Windows 11 or Windows 10, AVD, Amazon Workspaces. It really doesn't matter. We are completely agnostic when it comes to these things, and we can support you wherever you are. So that's just an overview of where we are and where we fit.
We are just like Switzerland.
There you go, Matt. So, this is an image which I'm sure, apart from the five screens, because I never had, as an admin back in the day, had five screens like that. That just, yeah. So, apart from that, logins are really frustrating. And that's what today is about, is helping you get past that frustration of logins. And we're going to really go deep on this. Matt is going to take you through some great data that kind of is going to help you really kind of understand this whole logon process and where he's going to give you tips on you can look for things, most likely where the cause is. Matt has a couple of pet peeves when it comes to this kind of thing, and he'll share those.
Just one or two.
Yeah, just one or two, as per usual. So yeah, this was just to kind of set the scene that this is what we're gonna. You won't feel like this by the end of this webinar, and that's our intention. Right. So, I think Andrew, you have the first poll question. which should be on everyone's screen. So we want to get an idea of what your logins are like. Are they under 20 seconds? Are they 20 to 40 seconds? Are they over 40? Now, I have a story. While we're waiting for this, I have a story to tell. A friend of mine, I put up a post today to promote this and talk a little bit about logins. And a friend of mine pointed out that he was dealing with a customer where the login was 45 minutes.
Uh,
They were in an off-site location, and the local admin didn't know that every time the person logged in, it was pulling down a 10 gig profile image. So what they had to do was someone in that office logged in before the doctor. Now this was a medical practice. So a doctor, before the doctors came in, someone came in, logged in, using had all the credentials for the different doctors. So if you think about that from a security, a compliant, it's just a nightmare. But it's just due to that level of frustration, this is the kind of action people will take. So this is why we really want to help with logins today. So now, here we go. So,
wow.
Matt, we have 15% at under 20 seconds.
I would love
Ooh.
to say I'm surprised, but I've been looking at Stratosphere data for about 17 years now, and I would argue that this is fairly normal for most organizations. Most organizations have unhealthy logins, and it's interesting that you were talking about a medical institution because just yesterday I was using Stratosphere to work in an organization. It was a children's hospital. I will not name them because they were one of my favorite clients. But they were to the point where doctors and nurses weren't able to log in within 10 minutes. And we actually traced it down to a new undocumented Microsoft feature using Stratosphere, all brand new stuff. And that's in many ways why the tool is so important, is because when you're dealing with new and cutting edge problems, you need new and cutting edge solutions.
So, Matt, just before we go any further, someone has asked for what is a technical definition of logon time?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's the specific time between the customer pressing enter on the keyboard until the actual start menu and taskbar are displayed on the desktop from a Windows perspective. If we're dealing with Mac or Linux, because we do that too, it's a teeny bit different, but it still works out with authentication to the system and or domain controller. So if we're being a little bit transparent here, we do more than that because the login in many times isn't just about what happens when you press enter and get to the taskbar. Sometimes you're dealing with machine group policy, sometimes you're dealing with boot issues, sometimes you're dealing with log off issues. And all three of those can weigh heavily on a user because if I open up my machine and power it on and it still takes 5 minutes before I can even get to control alt delete, isn't that important too? So we see a lot more than just login, and we're going to be talking about all that fun stuff today.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Matt. So, we're going to go deeper on the logons, but I just wanted to highlight this. Me and you have talked about this before, the cost of slow logins. Now, we've just put together a typical example of a 45-second login, which we've seen is about the average. Um, if you've got 1,000 employees, one logon a day, that's 162,000, over $162,000 wasted annually. Just so this really kind of, for me, highlights it. Yes, it's an inconvenience. We've seen the extremes of it there, where there's security and compliance issues caused by really bad logins. So, but this slide is all about focusing on the kind of the financial side of things. So there is a financial impact to these things. So we just wanted to highlight that to show you. As I said, this is a very vague example. We've got lots more of that we can help with in terms of doing it for your numbers, but this is just kind of to set the scene that there is a cost involved in these kind of logon issues. So, Matt, do you want to have a look here and talk us through some of these performance KPIs around logons?
Absolutely. We're going to be going pretty deep into a number of these a little bit later, but it's usually good to start from a high level. So in terms of KPIs, what do we care about the most? The biggest one is going to be login delay, the time for the user sign into a user desktop. Again, we get a little more granular than that. We would talk about the physical start menu being present in the system. Why? Well, just because you can see the desktop doesn't mean you can just interact with it yet. So it's the time to full interaction. And we want to make sure that we're under 30 seconds. Anything else? And by the way, the chat has been lighting up with all kinds of comments from users. I'm loving this interaction. And they're talking about going and getting coffee. In the case of going in 45 minutes, going and getting lunch, and then maybe your computer will log in. And all these things sound absolutely ludicrous to me. Sub 30 seconds, that's where we want to be. Now, on top of that, we also have the top user side GPO CSE, name plus lowest time. That is the single slowest user policy extension affecting logins this week. And we're going to dig into that and why those policies operate the way they are. We're also going to talk about legacy. And the reason that GPOs process the way they do is we're dealing with 30 plus years of GPO legacy inside of a system, and it's not organized the way that you think it's going to be. And what's great about the Stratusphere logins and taking all this stuff apart is that you get to see the dirty little secrets of what happens during a login, both good and bad. So we're going to talk about that as we literally take an entire login apart down to the thousandth of a second. I promise you won't be asleep during that process. So you want to make sure that you're finding out GPO and CSE loops and broken mappings silently tax every login. You want to dig those out very easily and quickly, and I'm going to show you how to use the tools to do that. We also want to need to know about the DC name and the IP address, so the actual domain controller that handled the login. We're going to talk about something called DC discovery time and why that matters and why that kind of sets the stage for everything that cascades after the fact. And we will need to be able to catch slow DCs, and DCs are slow for a number of different reasons. Not a lot of times people are going to blame the network. So they say, hey, the DC is slow because of the network. And a long, long time ago, in a previous life, I was a network engineer. And my first day in the job, do you know what they taught me? They said, Matt, if anyone ever comes up to you and says the network is a problem, your default response is going to be, it's not the network. One of my guys had a sign in his cubicle that literally said, it's not the network. And in this case, sometimes they're right. And we're going to talk about what things you can do to DCs to make sure that you bring down those times besides just going and saying it's the network. We're also going to talk about CPU during login, the machine CPU consumption during the login window, not just percentages, but we're also going to talk about the importance of something called CPU queue. If you've never heard that before, that's a fun one. We're going to talk about abnormal events. I've got lots of abnormal events in my environment, so we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about GPOs that have failed to execute. We're going to talk about a really interesting use case that I have reserved for this session, where what happens if the network's not available? What does that look like? What happens when the GPO fails due to the network not being around? And more importantly, how does Stratusphere get the data if the network's not available? That seems like kind of a chicken and egg thing. So we're going to play with that too. We're going to talk about GPO failures preventing the machine from operating properly. And we're going to talk about boot and login delay and how they're both kind of interlinked to each other. So that's all a preview of what we're going to be talking in a bit. You want to cover
So,
this one, or do you want me to do it?
yeah, go for it. Go for it. Yeah. Yeah.
So the login process is an interesting thing because inside of modern Windows logins, and when I say modern Windows logins, I really mean Windows XP and post, really starting to hit its stride in Windows 7, Windows 10, and Windows 11. Everything is a combination of both parallel and serial execution. Parallel meaning I can do multiple things at once, and serial meaning I can only do one thing before I have to wait for the other thing to fire off. So the login is actually a hybrid of both of those things at the same time, and we're going to show you how that actually works in a very simple way. But the login process itself does involve a series of what we call steps. And in Stratusphere, you're going to actually see those defined steps inside of the interface so you can kind of keep track of where we are. So the first thing is DC discovery, which is talking to the domain controller and saying, hey, how are you? This is me. This is my authentication. This is who I am. Do you know who I am? That kind of thing. And then after that, we have an authorization attempt where I am not only authenticating the user, but also the machine, because I can't let somebody attempt to log in until I know your machine is part of the domain. We're going to talk about DC operations. We're going to talk about the user profile service. And of course, we have our own user profile service. That's a fun conversation to have as well. We're going to talk about group policy user and group policy extensions, group policy scripts, the shell, and that is the shell is the actual front end of the operating system that you see. So when you're working with Windows, you're working with the shell. And of course, there's different pieces that take different times to load. And then we have post login activity. Well, wait a second. Once you're logged in, you're logged in, right? Well, no, because again, in an attempt to speed things up, what Microsoft has done is said, hey, if there's a process that can be deferred, if the login isn't necessarily where I need this executable to run in order to publish the desktop, maybe I publish the desktop first and then keep having things run after the fact to make sure that, yeah, you get your process, but my user gets the desktop as quick as we can possibly deliver it. And we're going to rip all this apart in a little bit. But before we get to that, James has some more slides for us. Oh, no, he doesn't.
No, I don't. So actually, I have one more slide before, and you can explain this one, seeing as it was your. It's about our data that we're going to talk about now.
So this was a fun conversation that James and I were having as we were discussing this webinar, because there's a new Stratusphere interface, and internally we all love the new Stratusphere interface because it's pretty and it's moving around and it's easy to work with and it's simple. The data that we're looking at today is none of those things. The data that we're looking at here is going to be raw, hard data. So if you're a data scientist, if you're an engineer, if you're an architect, you're going to look at this and you're going to say, this is awesome. But if you're someone who's really set up around aesthetics, this is not sexy. It's not very good looking data, because this is going to be deep inside of the section of Stratusphere where we're going to really start playing to the strengths of our data. And we collect over 6,000 metrics inside of a machine, and sometimes it's more important to be delivering that data than to make it look good. So this particular graphic is a play on something from a movie called Crazy People that came out around 35 years ago. Great movie. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. And inside of it, an advertising executive decides he's going to tell the truth, and he was trying to sell Volvos. He's saying, buy Volvos. They're boxy, but they're good. We know it's not sexy. Not a smart time to be sexy anyway, with all the crazy stuff going around. Be safe instead of sexy. Well, what we're going to be showing you today is safe instead of sexy. So with that, I think we're going to be transferring back over to me.
We are indeed.
All right. So let me share out my screen. And the first thing we're going to see is we're going to see sexy. This is the new Stratusphere interface. I happen to love this interface because it's not only easy to use, but it's also very easy to dive down into different parts, into real nitty gritty things with only 2 or 3 clicks. So if you've never seen the interface before, real simple. You can have at the top your machine groups, including all different kinds of groups and individual machines. We have user groups for, again, the same thing. I have sort by. If you notice, there's this funky little drop icon in the top right-hand corner. That's there because everything is designed in this interface to quote unquote bubble up. So if I have a problem, that problem should automatically rise to the top and say, hey, Matt, you have a problem with login delays. And you can see I have a big problem with login delays. Or you have a problem with machines by user experience or users by user experience. And what's great about Stratusphere is a learning appliance. So as soon as you turn it on, it learns about your organization and what we call your DEX fingerprint. And we use that to build a profile. So when I see all these crazy colors on the screen, and I know that green is good and yellow is okay, and or amber is okay, and red is poor, this isn't just out of the box stuff. This is based on your digital fingerprint. So I know this is correct for me. So case in point, if I start digging around into things like user experience, this is kind of where the rabbit hole starts. I'm first going to see information on the machines themselves. I'm going to be able to play with the data in any way that I want. And it's all very intuitive. And if I don't know what something is, I can simply hover over it and it's going to tell me what's going on. And we also highlight really complex things really easily. So I said before that we have something called a CPU queue is a big part of understanding whether or not something's busy or not, especially during a login. And a CPU queue is basically a measurement of how many instructions are waiting in the wings for the CPU. So modern CPUs process billions of instructions per second. Therefore, we want to make sure that the amount of instructions that are waiting is at or equal to the number of cores you have. So if I have 16 cores, then I want this to be at 16 or less. Well, that's a problem because everyone has different cores nowadays. So how do I make heads or tails of this? Well, easy. We divide the CPU queue by the core. And now I've got this really easy metric that says, are you using too much CPU? Is it less than 1? You're awesome. Is it 1 to 2? It's okay. Is it greater than 2? Well, now you're going to start seeing weird stuff. And the reason this is so important is because in modern versions of Windows, especially when we talk about cloud and VDI, Windows is very good at understanding what are my applications using in terms of CPU percentages. So I know Chrome is using 3% and Outlook's using 5%. But when I have to virtualize a bunch of drivers and hardware, as is the case of cloud, VDI, and in many cases, modern laptops, well, Windows isn't really good at understanding what's the video driver doing in terms of CPU consumption. So that whole percentage thing kind of goes out the window. This number, though, is rock solid because it tells me what is the physical hardware doing to make sure that I know what's going on. And if I dive down into this, I'm going to get even more information on what's eating up the CPU. Is it because I have low frequency or low number of cores, or GDI, which is 2D video, or the number of monitors because 2D video is rendered by the CPU now? All these things can impact that. So this is the sexy part of Stratusphere that I like very much and that I use very much, especially when I'm digging down into individual machines. But now we're going to do is we're going to jump into the advanced inspectors. And this is for the hardcore geeks like me, the data scientists, the guys who really want to wrestle with the information to find some stuff that is normally almost impossible to find. And in the case yesterday, when I was digging through that medical institution with all the doctors and nurses, this is one of the places that I was to figure out where that new piece of edge was that no one had seen before. So first things first, in the advanced inspectors, everything is sorted out by these tabs. The tabs are almost like the master tables inside of a database. So I have users and machines and logins and all kinds of fun stuff that I can play with. Today, we're going to mess around with the login section of Stratusphere, which is going to tell me information on three things: the boot process, the login process, and the log off process if your users actually log off. I have a lot of users that really forget to go and do that. I'm sure no one else has anything like that.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm definitely sure no one has that, Matt, where users don't log off. Yeah, or something. In fairness, now to some users, something is preventing that log off as well.
Ooh.
Which is another component of it. It's not quite as simple as, oh, he just didn't log off. Maybe something stopped it.
Or maybe it's a Windows update and the user knows that and they don't want to reboot, because I've never seen that before either. So when it comes to navigating the inspectors, I know it looks complex, but the reality is it's really actually pretty easy to do. There's only a handful of things you need to know. The first is the inspector view, and this is how you go and get back to your default view. So if you ever get lost or if you don't follow the breadcrumbs, click here and you'll get back. Next up is the date range, and we give you a bunch of pre-canned stuff, but if you want, there is a calendar option. You can set any time, any date, any option you want. Then you have your lookup table. I'm going to be using usernames in this case. Search box, where I can search for things. Resolution, where I can change how I'm divvying all these things up. Basis, which is another fun way of saying variables, so I can introduce other variables. Filters, and then I also have graphing options, table options. Why? Why would I have two different sets for graphs and tables? Well, you could almost consider this like a giant pivot table playground. So if you've ever used Excel before, you know that pivot tables are a great way of coordinating X and Y axes to see data in different ways. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So at the top where I have my graph options, I have a lot of different things that I can pull from during the login. We keep harping on things like DC discovery and why that's so important. Maybe I just want that. Maybe I want my group policy metrics. Maybe I want themes and parameters. Maybe I want trending. And when I go to trending, all this other crazy stuff spills out. And that's great for me to visualize things that are normally difficult to quantify inside of something like a table. And whenever I hover over any one of these objects, well, look at that. All this crazy stuff just pops out. That tells me not only about the login delay, but the boot delay by itself, which in this case is longer than the login delay, 73 versus 44 seconds. The two of them together, which I would argue is kind of the gold standard metric, because if I'm just measuring login delay, am I actually measuring what the user went through? No, because if I came in and turned on the machine and then had to wait for it and then had to log in, I should be measuring both those things together. And that's what we're doing here. We're doing boot only and boot plus login delay at the same time to kind of take the user's actual perception into account. We also understand about the CPU cores allocated, and we know how many cores are being used and what's going on with the CPU. So getting back to that whole understanding CPU consumption at the hardware level, it's all baked into it. I know about memory. I know about IOPS. I know about all kinds of fun things simply by hovering over one thing in a graph. And it's good to be able to say, hey, I can go and look at these data points and then go and quantify it back in the graph. What's cool is Stratusphere gives you infinite control. So that means I can swap graphs or I can turn them on and turn them off. And for the time being, I'm going to turn this graph off. And that's because I really want to focus on the meat of this data and what's actually going inside of it. Jack Smith is one of our senior engineers in the company. He's my West Coast SME. It's fun to pick on him, and we're going to be picking on him today because he is working on some stuff right now that's given him a 336-second login delay. That's insane.
What is Jack up to?
Jack's always up to crazy stuff. He is.
Yeah, that's true. In fairness,
He's also. I'm not going to poke any holes here, but he's also researching some competitor tools right now. I'm sure that won't come up at all. Anyway. What we have here is first my users, and my users are all the way down here on the left-hand side. We can see that I've got a whole bunch in here. Jack's come up in here multiple times. Why is Jack in here multiple times? Well, he logged in multiple times. He's doing some testing, and as a result, every time there's a login, I'm going to see him come in there. Hey, look at that. That's me. I had a pretty good login delay. We can pick on me a little bit later, but unfortunately, my login's a little boring because I actually optimize it. So you can see I've logged in the sub 30-second range that I'm constantly touting. On top of that, we also have the machine names that we're looking at. We have the login times, we have the log out times. And just like being able to break apart a log in, we can break apart a log out. Because again, the user's perception is important. And I want to account for when you're trying to go home at 5 o'clock on a Friday and it takes 5 minutes to log out and you're frustrated and you're angry and it's costing me an employee's mind. Maybe I want to look at that. Or maybe I have something like a multi-use workstation where when someone on a manufacturing floor goes to log off, if it takes 5 minutes before anybody else can log in, that's costing me money. I'm going to want to take a look at that. So each one of these is an interactive object. So I can click on any of these and I can get more information about it. So if I want to click on the username, I can go and do that. And you notice that immediately it says I can either drill down and launch a view on it. I can do the same thing on the machine name, the login time, or the logout time. And that's all great. But now we're going to start getting into the nitty gritty of what actually makes a login work. So we're going to be on this screen for a little while. I apologize if it doesn't move for a bit, but there's a reason and a method to my madness. The first is understanding what these variables are. And if you notice, everything flows from left to right. Why? This is the actual flow of the login. So we did all this on purpose, grouping things together in terms of what the user experiences during the process of a login. So what's the first thing that happens? Well, you boot the machine. You turn the machine on. And remember, in Stratusphere, if you ever don't know what something is, just hover over the top object of that particular column, and it'll spit out everything that we know about it. Fast startup optimizations and all that fun stuff. It's all listed here. And this is basically saying this is how long it took to go from machine power on to Control-Alt-Delete. And then we have boot plus login delay, that really important metric of everything the user sees between powering on to physically getting to a desktop. Wait a second. What about that time in between that? What about the time that goes from I powered on the machine, I went and got coffee, the machine sat at Control-Alt-Delete for 2 minutes, and then I logged in? Does that count against the boot plus login time? No. We subtract that time out, so we know it's just the pure amount of time it took for the machine to boot. If a user was really just sitting there absolutely eyeballing the machine and saying, I'm going to press my password, and as soon as it's there, well, you'll get pretty close. The login delay itself, as we mentioned before, is the time from authentication to Explorer EXE full execution. So when you can physically see a taskbar. Logout delay is the opposite. It's the time that we get from clicking log out in the box, getting back to Control-Alt-Delete in the system. And now we get into the anatomy of a login. The first thing we talked about is DC discovery. So I said that this was important for a number of reasons. I said this basically sets the stage for everything that carries on down the line. The magic number that we usually like to strive to is 0.300, so 300 milliseconds. If I see anything above 300 milliseconds, I'm going to be cranky because it means that other things in the login.
you don't want a cranky Matt.
No, you don't want a cranky Matt. It's not a good scene. My wife hates it. Anyway. When we have something like a high DC discovery time, you'll see this cascade all the way down. And a good example is right here. So I have this Tom Wynn guy, and this is actually one of my real engineers on his real machine, and he's got a bit of a DC issue. He's taking almost a full second to do his DC discovery, which means that everything down the line is going to be slower as a result of this. And you can see that all these red boxes show up, where his DC operations is slow, and his group policy is slow, and his network restore. So that's the reason we kind of complaining about DC discovery so often, is that if your DC discovery is slow, everything else is. If DC's discovery is fast, now we can say, all right, at least the DC operations, the physical things that I'm interacting with back and forth, at least those will be quick. And now the only thing I have to worry about is what we call payload, actual execution from the DC occurring during the login. All right, so what do I do if I have a really high DC discovery? Well, the first thing you should investigate is how far is the user from the domain controller. If they are a couple of milliseconds away from it, and again, a ping test will reveal that, even something like breaking down the login will tell you, because, case in point, we show you exactly what's going on, and that means how long it takes to ping the DC. So that's the first thing I want to know. How long did it take to ping the DC? Now, if the DC took 1 millisecond to ping, and I've still got a 900 millisecond DC discovery time, what does that mean? It usually means once you've taken the DC out of the equation, and once you've taken the actual network out of the equation, it's usually about the actual hardware that's provisioned to the domain controller, because most of these are virtual right now. And I've met plenty of organizations who say, yeah, one CPU core, that'll be fine for a DC. No, that's crazy. Modern versions of Windows have a lot of things going on. A single threaded CPU is not enough for a domain controller. We want to make sure that the domain controller has room to breathe. Plenty of CPU, plenty of memory, plenty of disk. And the easiest way to do that is put Stratusphere on it. If I put Stratusphere on a domain controller, I can tell you if it's heavy. I can tell you if the CPU is pegged out, if the memory is pegged out, if there's a problem with IOPS or anything else. Tune the DC, because if you do that, and if the network's healthy, all of these DC discovery numbers come down. And as a result, everything down the board gets better as a result. So make sure your DCs are healthy, make sure your network is healthy, and then DC discovery will be good. Unless your user is communicating via VPN and Bora Bora or something like that, then we can only do so much. Next up is DC operations. This is communication between the group policy client and the domain controller. So after we've authenticated your machine, which happens before the actual logon, we've authenticated the user during Control-Alt-Delete. Now we have base DC operations for GPO. That says, hey, Mr. GPO, what do you need me to do? And that really involves saying, well, are you on a slow link or a fast link? So we actually do a miniature bandwidth test during the login, and we say, I want to measure the bandwidth of your system to the DC, and based on that bandwidth, I'm either going to do push the policies down now, or I'm going to say, hey, let's wait a minute on that. Let's log you in because your latency is like 280 milliseconds, and it's going to take 20 minutes to run, so let's do that later. That is a group policy settable object, by the way. Then we have group policy for the computer, which is typically happening before I log into the system. Group policy for the user, and we're going to talk about why I'm not a big fan of GPO and what you can do to speed this up. I'm going to give you a little sneak preview. A good way of speeding this up is using something that's parallel and it can work with GPO natively. Profile Unity, sorry. Got a little bit of a cough there. We also have group policy extensions. These are things that you add in addition to group policy. They're usually third party. So if we have any kind of client extensions, you're going to see those there. We have scripts. Scripts are not my favorite thing in the world. We're going to talk about why scripts are not my favorite thing in the world. And then we also have authentication attempt, or how long it took to authenticate to the DC. Network providers, which again, we don't have as many of these as we used to, but they're network specific protocols or other network related stacks, usually before the user log on. Back in the days of IPX, SPX, and I know no one wants to talk about Novell, these used to be a much bigger deal. The user profile service. So if you're using something like, I don't know, Profile Unity, it's going to show up here. If you're not, it's also going to show up here because Windows still has to load its own profile. Restoring the network. So connections to network connections in UNC paths. Shell, which is, of course, Explorer EXE. Themes, which is whatever pretty stuff you've put on your desktop, and parameters. All that's great. So if we notice, everything here is based on a series of color codes. And these are all based on best practices from Microsoft. So Stratusphere is smart enough to recognize very easily what's good, what's bad, and what's not so good. And we said before that yellow is in the middle and red's at the top. What's going on with this orange stuff? Well, this is that semi-state between what we call a tier 1 and a tier 2 standard deviation. So Stratusphere is very math heavy in the background. So in the background, we're doing all this really nasty math. And we want to say, all right, let's deviate or understand the deviation away from normal. 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations. Yellow is 1, red is 2, amber is 1.5. So it's right there in the middle. So if you're looking for the easy button of how to understand all this stuff, just look for the color. It's really that simple. Yellow is not so great. And this amber is it's really not so great. Red is you're a mess. So we know that Jack Smith is an absolute mess. We know that Spellichet is an
Yeah.
absolute mess. Different conversation to be had, James. Anyway, I really hope Jack is not on this webinar right now because we've made fun of him like 3 times. Anyway, the other thing that I consider monumentally important when it comes to all of this stuff is this funny little column over here called abnormal events. And I'm going to sort by abnormal events because I have like 130 logins right now. And I think it's worth talking about. Abnormal events if you're looking at something that's physically broken inside of the login. And a lot of times this winds up being something like group policy or something else. And I'm being pretty con here because I've only got stuff today and I've got no abnormal events. But I want you to watch what happens when I go and start pushing this back in time. So right now, we're just looking at my logins today, mostly because it was fun to go and make fun of Jack. But if I start looking at the logins over a longer period of time, what you're going to notice is a tad more anomalies pop up. And if I go and say, all right, show me what's going on with the logins over the course of a week, and then if I go and sort by that same object we had before, which is abnormal events, all of a sudden, a bunch of stuff is just going to kind of spill out. And oh, look at that. We've got some abnormal events. Now, what does that mean? That means that something inside of the login process is physically preventing the login from operating normally. Now, a lot of times that means something like, well, I just lost a few seconds of execution. Maybe it's a script that points to nowhere. Maybe it's something else. But what really concerns me is when I start seeing stuff like this, where I have multiple abnormal events inside of a single system. So this user right here, Glenn Porter, he's got 6 abnormal events right now. And I'm probably going to want to dig into that because there's something here that's fundamentally broken. And in some cases, you can say, well, Matt, this doesn't make any sense because I can see the login delay for this user was fast. Well, how is the login fast, but they have 6 abnormal events? What is Brandon's problem? Well, let's go find out. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into that specific login time for Brandon. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to isolate what's going on with his abnormal events. And if you notice, just like before, we have graphing options up top, and then we have data options at the bottom. So I'm going to go and minimize the graph by clicking on this little toggle graph option, and I'm going to see what's going on. So if you notice, we're telling you not only about login delay, but boot delay. And I said that's really important because the things that happen before an authentication and a login are sometimes a big deal. So in fact, 4 seconds before the user logged in, there was a bunch of errors. Now, what I can do is I can very easily just Google all these event IDs. So I can Google, for example, event ID 7320. So I can type in event ID and then paste in 7320, and Google will tell me what's going on, and computers determined not to be in a site. Well, that's kind of crazy, huh? Or I can let Stratusphere tell me more about this specific login and this specific boot. How do I do that? Well, if you notice, there's this funny little box here called Zoom by. And Zoom by is one of my favorite places to go because I can go further into whatever I'm seeing here. So I can look down at dates, machines, users, login breakdowns. I can see a summary view. I can see an overview view. Or if you're hardcore geek like me, then you're going to want to see the login details and just jump straight into everything and see everything down to the thousandth of a second. And there's a reason I'm doing this because, again, just like before, some things that happen before the user logon are really, really important. And Stratusphere is kind of screaming at me right now. It's got all these pink options. That means, here, take a look at me. There's an error. And I can go and I can Google all this stuff, or I could just read the error codes. And the error codes are telling me what? The network is not present or not started. So this is kind of a double-edged sword. The reason that this logon was so fast is because we didn't really process anything from the domain. This was what we call a cached login. So this is what happens when you log in using a cached count from your DC, but you can't actually talk to the network. So two things are kind of making me weird here. Number one, how does Stratusphere know this if we can't communicate with the network? And number two, what happens during that whole process? Well, what winds up happening is whatever happened last time during the last login for GPO processing, that's what we use. And there are limits on this because there is a certain amount of time that you can be outside of the DC before it just won't let you authenticate anymore. But this is what happens is that it says, I don't have a network. I'm going to let you log in. Let's go through the process. All right, but that doesn't explain how did Stratusphere get this data if the network's not around? And the answer is we cache it. So we have the ability to cache up to 2 weeks worth of data in Stratusphere. So if I have something really weird going on where if a user and they've been away from the farm for a long time and they haven't authenticated into AD and they're seeing all kinds of weird stuff and they say, hey, can you help me out? All we have to do is say, plug your machine in, Stratusphere will update the data, and I can tell you what was going on, even though your machine never saw the network. Really fun stuff. Now, I want to go backwards a little bit, and I want to talk about taking apart the login itself and all the other stuff that we took a look at. So I'm going to go click on my breadcrumbs, and these little guys up here, these are my breadcrumbs. I'm going to click return to top, and that's going to bring me back to the login that I saw before. And we're going to start picking out at a few different logins. Specifically, we're going to call out some logins that were a little bit, they were sloppy. They weren't very nice. And we're going to talk about what actually goes on in between the login process and how to do some really heavy troubleshooting with Stratusphere. So in the example that I was giving yesterday about the medical institution or some of the other examples that I gave before where I'm really doing some heavy troubleshooting, this is how I go and do it. And as this process will work on anything that I have seen so far. So I do login process breakdowns a lot. I've done this for hundreds of organizations. And whenever I'm doing it, the process is pretty much all the same. The first thing I do is I go into my advanced inspectors and I sort by login delay. Why? Well, I want to see the worst users first. And I want to, in the back of my head, start correlating all the times I see columns popping up. So, for example, DC Discovery, I see a little bit, not terrible. I'm probably going to keep an eye on that. DC Operations, same thing. But as I start to get into group policy, now things start to come up a little bit more. I'm seeing more reds. So I know there's a problem with computer group policy, user group policies. Definitely got a problem. Jeff Bridges is having a bad day. Group policy extensions, same thing. Scripts are okay. Authentication attempts okay. User profile service is a mess. Restoring network is okay. Shell is bad for some people and updating parameters. Now, in any of these cases, a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm troubleshooting either a group or a single login. So let's run through both. If I'm troubleshooting a group, I'm going to want to go through these individual areas and start picking them out one by one. So if I have a problem with DC Discovery and it's lighting up like a Christmas tree, I want to focus there. In my case, I have a problem with user group policy and the user profile service. So I'm going to want to spend my time there. I will probably start doing zoom by and looking at those two areas. But the single biggest use case that I get is this. I have either a CTO, a CIO, a CXO, some executive who's having a login problem, and we need to sniff that one single login. Or I have a doctor or nurse who's the worst there, and I need to sniff their login and find out what's going on. In other words, I need to find common threads within the login that are making it slow. How do I do that? Well, the first thing you do is you go and you click on the login time in question. And that's going to bring you back to the screen that we saw a little while ago. That's going to summarize all the things that I have that's part of my login. So I have my boot delay, computer group policy service, all that happens before I press Control-Alt-Delete, updating the per user systems parameters. Again, look at the timeline that's before Control-Alt-Delete, and then boom, at 0 seconds, we have authentication. That is me hitting enter on my keyboard after I type in my password. And then we can see that this is broken up into a series of steps. Now, I mentioned before that Windows is both parallel and serial on login. What does that mean? That means that there are certain things that need to get done before I can pass on to the next step. So I need to authenticate into AD before I can move on to, for example, the user profile service. I need the user profile service before I can execute user GPO. Why? Well, if I don't have the user's registry, there's no place to put the GPOs. Each of these are what we call a dependency. So whatever's inside of them, as long as it's marked to do so, needs to finish before the next step kicks off. So inside that step, I can run things parallel, but each step is a serial execution, one by one by one by one by one, because it's a dependency. All right, so how do I possibly make heads or tails of this? Easy. We go to zoom by, and we go to login details. And this is going to expose the login down to the thousandth of a second. Now, at first, this is going to look really complicated, but there's a very easy way to break it down. First things first, look at the graph. When I see the graph here, all these towers that I have here, each of these is telling me where to look inside of the event timeline. So I know the user profile service, whenever I see a spike there, I know what to look for that. When I have a user profile load, there's a spike there, look for that. I have search protocol host, everyone's favorite thing inside of a Windows login because we all use search all the time and it's very slow. I want to look at that. We also see that there's main user group policy service and some other stuff that's fun. All right. So when I'm troubleshooting a login, what do I do? Because when I start to get into these tables, it's really easy to get lost in all this data, isn't it? Well, there's a couple things to remember. In reality, there's only 3 things you have to look for. Number one, the most important one, is the logon delay, or what we call the timeline. In other words, this is the user's perception of how long it's actually taking the logon to occur. I would argue this is the most important thing. Now, the second thing that we have is something called duration. And the duration is all these different parallel processes that are running within this step. And we kind of covered this step earlier. The step is a dependency that I need to do and complete before I can move on to the next thing. So in this case, I see my login timeline starts at 0 seconds, and we see a bunch of stuff happened, and we authenticated the user, and we did a user logon notification, and we did themes on login pre, and we said, okay, my step is done. So this is finished. Authenticating user took, in this case, not very long, 0.762 seconds. That's fast. That's good. Then the next step is to do what? Load the user profile service. Uh-oh, what's going on here? Now we can see that the login timeline is fine. Then all of a sudden it starts to shoot up, doesn't it? Because remember, some of these things are parallel and serial. So the magic trick here, whenever I'm troubleshooting a login, is all I need to do is look to see where the login timeline jumps, and whatever is next to it is the problem. It's really that simple. So I've chosen this one specifically because there's more than one problem, and it's kind of obvious to see what's going on. But let's go through it together. So at exactly 7 seconds in on this machine, search protocol host ran, and we can see it's running for 289 seconds. That is awful. So what's actually going on here? Well, we're establishing group policy search on a new machine. And a funny thing happens. If you grab this little scrolly bar and move it to the right, we can actually see how many machine cores this thing has and what's being consumed by it and what it's doing. So in this case, I know that I only have 2 cores in this box, and those 2 cores are pretty busy because just processing search, not anything else in this list, just processing search takes 1/3 of a core. That's a lot. And 71% of machine memory. Anyone see a problem here? 71% of memory just logging in. I might not have enough memory. And the IOPS, again, are pretty high here because that's what search does. It's searching my disk. So we can see that this is memory starved. It's CPU starved. But remember, it's not the only thing running. So as I start digging down, we can see all these other processes start eating up the CPU. So search is firing off, la, 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 it's going and searching the disk. And then suddenly we have other things firing up. Service host. We have some handle files for ntuser.dat. That's my registry. We can see that user class.dat is being loaded. All these things are being loaded. And as they get loaded, look what's going on to my consumption. Well, everything's okay until I get right here. And then I'm trying to load the user profile service, and magically, look at that. All of a sudden, my timeline jumps up. So in this case, what I have is I have a system that's starved for resources, even doing basic Windows things. And the reason we set up this machine like this is so you can look very easily to understand how to find bad things. Look for the timeline to jump up by a large amount. When I go from 7 seconds to 32 seconds, whatever is there is the problem. In this case, it's search protocol host. If I see the same thing, look to the right, and it will tell me exactly what's going on. Okay, great. So that's the first big piece. How do I use this interface to troubleshoot something and I don't know what it is? And that process I just taught you works everywhere. So if you go further on down to the user group policy service, it works here too. If you go down even further to post group policy service, it works there as well. Now, I know I have done this already, but I'm going to get in a soapbox now. We're going to talk about why I don't really care for modern GPO. And Stratusphere makes it very obvious what GPO is doing. So when I start digging down into group policy, we can see the individual details of what group policy is doing. And the first thing it does is it talks to my DC and it says, okay, this is who I am, this is where I am. And it says, how long did it take to discover the DC? 156 milliseconds to ping it. And then it says, okay, am I in loopback mode? No. And background processing? No. And then it does a bandwidth test. Why? Because it's trying to figure out, is this link fast or slow? Do we use cache GPO or the real deal? This is real deal, so it's going to run GPO as it does. So if you've never seen this before, here's how group policy works. It splits things up into 3 separate sections. The first is the policy itself, which is a single INI file. Each GPO you have has its own INI file. Each one is pulled down, not in parallel, but in serial. You can actually see that here. Here's my Chrome policy. If I have any other policies after that, they are pulled down as a separate INI. And if you notice, during this entire process, the clock is still running. So that means that we're waiting on GPO to download an INI file for every GPO you have. And that means if I have 30 GPOs, this process goes on for a while and it's not done yet. So let's go on to page 2. We see we're still in the thick of GPO and it's going to be downloading some more INIs. And then finally it gets done with the processing of the INIs. Now it needs to move on to client-side extensions. What does that mean? That means taking each INI, transferring it into Windows code, and then pushing it down to the system. And you guessed it, all of these things are serial as well. So that means the more GPOs you have, the worse your login gets. And then to add insult to injury, now we have scripts. And the reason I don't like scripts is because just like the GPOs, scripts are serial and I have to wait for them to process. Now we're 470 seconds into this login and we're saying, you're going to have to wait some more because we have to process a script. How do we fix this? Well, there's 3 things that you can do that I've seen in timeless environments, countless environments, that works the best. Number 1 is GPO consolidation. So if I have 30 GPOs and I can consolidate those in any way, that's a huge deal. Because instead of processing 30 INIs one by one, and then understanding how to convert the INIs to registry code one by one, and then adding the registry code to the system one by one, which is massively inefficient, I can say, well, what if I have one consolidated GPO? Well, that's only one INI process, one series of reg codes to make, one series of reg codes to dump. And that means that your logins, in this case for GPO processing, will go 30 times faster. Huge once you see how this works. The next thing is scripts. Anything you can do to minimize or eliminate a script is a big deal. Now, again, I work for Liquidware, so my first answer for this is going to be use Profile Unity. Why? It is a parallel executing environment. So instead of running a script for things like the map drives and my printers and all that other crazy stuff, wouldn't it be great if I could run a parallel process that did 30 map drives at the same time? I know there can only be 26, whatever. Or maybe I have 15 printers and I want to do all those at the same time. Again, that's going to help you. If I minimize the scripts and consolidate the GPO, everything's great. But wait a second, Profile Unity can't do GPO. Yes, it can. In fact, Jason Smith, who is one of our premier marketing guys, he's actually a VP of marketing, is going to be talking about that in a few weeks, where you can use Profile Unity to replace this massively inefficient chunk of code that is group policy processing. So,
Matt,
yes,
we have a ton of questions, and we're going to run out of time, so I need to get a couple of them answered by you. So
absolutely, go ahead.
let's go. Devin was asking about the login numbers in the poll. Were they generated in an environment without an antivirus? Well, most of them were coming from the attendees, so we would guess so. And then he was asking about, are AppX packages removed? What conditions around the optimization?
So if it's anything like the clients that I work with, most of my standard clients are using modern apps. They are using some form of optimizations in VDI, but typically not in desktops and laptops. Everyone's got AV. Most organizations have at least one security system. And it pains me to say this. I ran into an organization not even 2 weeks ago that had 8 security tools in the images, including 2 AVs. So unfortunately, runaway security is a thing, and those definitely impact login times, and we will see it.
Okay. Another question. When you started with the dashboard, someone is asking, Paul is asking, how customizable are the dashboards? So,
Right now, they are not heavily customizable because we are still in what we consider the infancy of what we call Stratusphere new UI. But in newer versions, there will be more customization. You will be able to change the colors, you will be able to change the sequencing and things like that. By default, right now, if I want to modify these things in terms of searching and sorting, the first thing I would do is go to the sort by option. There are
mm,
custom sorting options available there. We can do this alphabetical, severity, things like that. But as this interface grows, the ability to modify these preferences are going to grow as well.
but you can tailor it for different roles, can't you? The
Yes.
dashboard.
Yep,
Yes,
that's
that was
correct.
mainly Paul's question around that. Okay,
I took
let's
the
keep
long way
going.
around.
Another person asked. I don't know why it came up as an anonymous attendee, but it says we get corrupt FS Logic profiles at times. Can we identify that with Stratusphere?
Yes, you can. That is a common thing that I see. Again, this is not meant to be a ProU commercial, but ProU does work in conjunction with FS Logics to create disks that can immediately fix themselves, immediately rehydrate themselves, immediately recreate themselves if you jump to a new operating system. The way that it will show up inside of here is the first thing will happen is you'll see the VHDX try to load, and that's one command. And then the second thing that'll happen is you'll see Windows try to load something like the registry. Usually it's ntuser.dat, and you'll get one of those pink lines that I saw before. So when we were at the beginning of this and we saw all those errors highlighted in pink, the specific error that you're going to get is unable to load ntuser.dat if you get full corruption. So that's the short version to see it. And if you want to make sure that never happens again, use Profile Unity in FS Logics mode.
Excellent. Paul asked again. He was asking about our integration with other solutions. Do you want to?
There's a
So,
lot. So
yeah.
Stratusphere has a full API, meaning that we're designed to go and take this data and push it into other solutions. And in fact, we make it as easy as possible to do that. In fact, I kind of like this UI very much when it comes to integrating with other things. So the big stuff that I usually see a lot is I see Tableau, I see ServiceNow, I see Power BI, I see Splunk. Those are the big four that I usually see. But any tool that can accept JSON data can accept any of the 6,000 plus metrics that we have baked into Stratusphere. And you thought I was kidding about the 6,000 metrics? Look at that list. These are all the metrics that we have available. It's insane how much data we have.
Okay. Bert is asking, what is the performance impact of our agent? And someone else asked earlier on, does each endpoint require an agent? And yes, the answer to that question.
Yep. The numbers that I give out officially for the Stratusphere agent are as follows. We use less than 0.1% of your CPU. We use approximately 25 megabytes of RAM. We use less than zero point 0.1 IOPS per hour of disk bandwidth, and we use 250 kilobytes of network bandwidth per hour. That is it.
All right, let's go back to the slides just for a minute because we've literally got a minute left. So switch back to the slide. So based on everything Matt's talked to you about there, what do you believe is the biggest hidden contributor to your slow Windows logins? So if you vote there, I'm going to keep progressing the slides. And we wanted to show some of the differentiators. So Matt, we you talked through a lot of this already about the pre-task CPU and RAM and how we break it down by processes and that. We've already talked about how we integrate with other kind of SIM and ITSM dashboards, event level tracing. You showed that. And then we've already said we work across anything. So, Andrew, have we got the poll results? We are going to share the infographic which we've used for a lot of the slides here. Matt, everyone said group policy.
That's crazy. I never would have seen that coming.
Okay, so we are going to share this infographic with everyone. So we have a really nice infographic that breaks down all the different elements we've had within the slides. So, Andrew, have we got a winner for the competition? If you've got more questions, we'd love to see you on our Slack community. There is a QR code here. Finally, we also have our new value calculator. So we've shown you the visibility with logins. If you want to get costs visibility, check out our calculator and it will determine how we can save you money within your environment. And finally, while we're waiting, if we would love to hear from you what you think of our products, you can give us a Gartner rating. So there's a QR code here, and you can for Stratusphere and Command Control. Thank you, everyone, and we have a winner. It is Kevin Skelly. So, Kevin, you have won the Bose speaker. So, round of applause for Kevin.
All right.
Well done, Kevin. We will get in touch with you. Thanks to everyone for their feedback, for the questions. As we can see, there were so many people on today, and it just shows even in 2025, logins are still an issue. And I think we've just highlighted how we can help. And if you have any questions, as I said, join the community. You can reach out to any of us through that or send an email to info@liquidware.com. Matt, thanks as always. This has been absolutely brilliant. And thank you so much to everyone for attending, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.